One of the most ridiculous claims some musicologists made all of us believe is the fact that musical tempi during the 19th century became slower, and became slower drastically. So, you hear me right. We are supposed to believe that Beethoven in 1805 played incomparably faster than Rubinstein end of the 19th century and way faster than any virtuoso today, or that beginners in the time before the industrial movement began easily outperformed the Rachmaninoffs of early 20th century or the Pollinis and Lisitsas of today. The reason why we are not supposed to question this weird claim is simple. Anyone accepting the half or single beat metronome practice as an unquestionable default position will face an insolvable problem, if not accepting this axiom as well. The unprovable axiom on the historic decrease of tempi is the center of the half or single beat belief. Because imagine this. Thousands of tempi given by musicians in the 19th century are out of reach for any living human being born on planet Earth. So how can you make the case for half-beat metronome practice when tempi would have gone up instead of down? Let me make this as concrete to you as possible. If we stick to the current academic position on tempo research, 15 notes per second would have been easily within reach of the average piano student of 1820. There will be, of course, not a single musicologist making their claims as practical as I do here, for a reason you easily can come up with yourself. To let you experience how insane that claim actually is, I give you Vivian Harvey Slater's 1969 version of Czerny's Etude Opus 299 number 28. She takes a tempo that's 39% below Czerny's metronome mark read in half or single beat, and still with a constant rate of 9 notes a second, very impressive. So, what you just heard is an impressive tempo indeed, with, as said, a constant rate of 9 notes a second. It are only our top virtuoso pianists of today that can repeat what Vivian Harvey Slater demonstrated here in her 1969 recording. And yet, Czerny's tempo, again, read in half beat, requires a constant speed of 15 notes a second. The easy average of the 1820 standard. Her recording, digitally adjusted with 39%, sounds like this. And by the way, I hope you don't think I'm skeptical when I criticize some musicologists. It simply is the truth. Still in 2016, Maarten Noorduin received a doctoral title for his work on Beethoven tempi. Though he did a great job in collecting all information you possibly can imagine, still there was not a single word, pun not intended, on a possible alternative for these metronome marks, although he disconnected on purpose every practical demonstration from his conclusions. Only that decision is weird, beyond words for a research on musical tempi, because what's a tempo research worth if not practically tried out? For the fastest and very problematic Beethoven tempi, the classic solution of the single beaters was again good enough. It's of course Beethoven who made the mistake, not we. So no, only the fact that on that high academic level there is no researcher, no jury, no peer review team that would accept an even minor claim for the simplest of simplest solutions to these endless lists of impossible tempo indications leaves no room but to call that research extremely biased and absolutely not neutral. And we all know that neutrality, but at the bare minimum an absolute willingness to face any consequence of the outcomes of our research, is the foundation for any research that has a chance of leading to the solutions of the truth. So you see the problem? A guy like Noorduin looks over all of these metronome marks and would not have scratched his head in how he is going to explain that in his doctoral thesis? Are you serious? You really believe he has not talked about this problem with his mentor Barry Cooper? You really believe the whole beat metronome theory has not been mentioned in their conversations? I leave them to defend whatever they want to defend and you to decide whatever you want to believe. But fact is that they have to keep telling us that tempi slowed down during the 19th century. How else are they supposed to make their case to never abandon that unquestionable default position of half-beat metronome practice? All musicians, in all times, use the metronome or pendulum in exactly the same way we think is right, and regardless of any facts, figures, outcomes of our research, we will bend the results always to the outcome we want. Period. No discussion. Have an article peer-reviewed, you say? Guess who will peer-review that and what their eyes will scan for first? As someone famously said once, it's a big club and you ain't part of it. You might think I'm somewhat on the defensive side right now, but as a matter of fact, it is simply the truth. And honestly, it's an annoying truth to say the least, because musicologists like these block the road to Beethoven paradise for all music lovers. And they do it on purpose, for God only knows which reason. It certainly is not for love of truth, that's for sure. It has been always my position that you will not find one line written in the 19th century that will factually support the mentioned claim. And even though I might have read only 0.0000001% of all that has been written back then, I'm pretty sure my claim will hold till eternity. I'm not saying, by the way, that you'll never find a contemporary remark on a particular performance that was considered to be too slow, though also those remarks will turn out to be significantly fewer than those delivering the opposite critique. But when musicians write about evolution of tempi in general, in the 19th century, it is always from the same perspective, critique on the general practice to increase tempi, and to increase them drastically. That critique starts already with Beethoven himself, and will even resonate with someone like Camille Saint-Saëns or Pugnò, early 20th century. In case you doubt about Beethoven, I'll make a segment with his remarks on tempi, but for today, let's focus on a forgotten giant of the 19th century, someone who the great Franz Liszt called one of the pillars of piano playing, and I'm talking of nobody less than Ignaz Moscheles. Moscheles is a unique musician for our cause. He was born in Prague in 1794, only 7 years after Mozart conducted the premiere of his Don Giovanni in this city. He died at age 76 in Leipzig, where he had returned to from London on the request of his friend Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy to take care over the piano department of his newly established conservatory. Moscheles was in close contact with all the great musicians and composers we can only dream of having listened to. His best friend certainly was Mendelssohn, but he had contact with the Schumanns, Chopin, Liszt, Wagner, could see Clementi walk in his garden from his apartment in London, was close to Carl Maria von Weber, Kramer and so many more. And he was one of the intimates of nobody less than Beethoven. He made, under Beethoven's supervision, the piano reduction of his Fidelio, of which I have here the first print. This little book was buried under a large pile of old LPs given to me a few years ago. And on top of all of that, our friend Moscheles kept a diary his entire life. Large excerpts of it were published by his wife in 1872, 2 years after his death. And of that publication I have here a first edition as well, a gift from our friend Lorenz Gradient. But you can read the English translation as well in 2 books and a relatively cheap edition, reproduction by Dover, or download this one, the 1873 translation from archive.org. or look for a second-hand copy of this very nice translation and summary by the hand of Emil Smitta. When reading Moscheles' story, something that I would demand from all my students should I have been ever in a teaching position, you'll notice from mid-1830, 1840 onwards an increasing number of entries talking about a new style of performing. It must have been a drastic shift in not only performance habits by a new generation, but also something the audience expected. In 1839 we read for the first time the idea of quitting musical stage, and I quote, "I am thinking in particular of Clementi, who bequeathed an immortal treasure both to his art and to his disciples, but who gave up playing while the top and coming generation of pianists flourished by using the same methods as he had done, altering them slightly and thereby establishing a new school. The disciples of this school, while supposedly taking its guidelines on principle, actually despise them on principle as well, and their strength is derived only from the enormous power of their hands. While enthusing in their unbelievably sickly manner, they seek their most piquant effects by the swiftest alteration between the sustaining pedal and the soft pedal, or in the use of rhythms and modulations which, although not entirely frowned upon, were previously permitted only in the rarest cases. It goes without saying that I have not joined these innovators. I do not like much of what they do, and I would be unable to emulate the power they employ in their playing. Moreover, I still feel very much at home with my own school of playing, and neither too old nor unnerved by these new developments. In my school, use of power such as this was quite unheard of. The less interest the world takes in my performances in the future, the greater I shall feel the desire and need to devote myself to my compositions." End of quote. Says the pianist who traveled as one of the first throughout entire Europe collecting success after success. I leave many other entries for you to read and skip to 1846, where we read the same remark on the old school, by which he meant the Mozart, Beethoven, Clementi school, and I quote, "I have always belonged to a school of pianism which seeks to put far more stress on clarity and accent rather than on loud bashing on the keys, and more stress too on the correct understanding of a work and being able to render this in one's playing rather than on surprising effects." End of quote. Remarks on tempi are more regular from this moment onwards. In 1849 he comments on a concert with music by Mendelssohn, not yet 2 years after his death. I quote, "Everything was captivating and beautiful. However, I found that some of the tempi were not in accordance with my tradition." End of quote. A few years earlier, in 1846, he heard Mozart's Magic Flute in Leipzig. I quote, "The ouverture to the Magic Flute was superb, as it was not too fast." End of quote. The most explicit in 1858, written directly after hearing a Gewandhaus concert with music of Mozart. I quote, "The second part with Mozart's C major symphony played impeccably, and yet to my mind the tempo of the first and last movement were too fast. Is it because I'm older and my blood is circulating more slowly? Or is it that the others are following a new direction, where everything is carried to the extremes?" End of quote. I think we all know the answer to that open question. A final quote from 1862, a quote that is often related to as a comment on the Wagner concert, which might be possible, but I do not see that connection right away. It's written as a general statement anyway, and it's an important quote. I quote, "I know many think me old-fashioned, but the more I consider the tendency of modern taste, and when I hear one of the old Sebastian Bach's glorious fugues in the midst of all these fantasias, I accept it as a kind of musical peace offering. Not that I'm completely reconciled, for it is usually taken prestissimo. Here, as elsewhere, I miss the right tempi, and look in vain for the traditions of my youth. That tearing speed, which sweeps away many a little note, that spinning out of an andante until it becomes an adagio, an andante con moto in which there is no moto at all, and allegro commodo, which is anything but comfortable. All such anomalies more my enjoyment." End of quote. You can imagine which part of the last quote gets the full attention today. But what Moscheles writes here on the fast tempi, being taken to tearing speeds which sweeps away many little notes, is without exception explained, I kid you not, as a proof that tempi in the 19th century slow down. You might look surprised now, since Moscheles factually is speaking about tempi taken faster than usually was the case in his younger years, but the musicologists of today reverse this completely. They claim that Moscheles was influenced by the new style of slowing down so much that every time he heard orchestras or musicians play in the old correct tempo, or what we believe were the correct tempi, he comments on their tempi being too fast. Yes, one needs some extreme level of resourcefulness, but that's how we are supposed to prove the 19th century mysterious decline in piano technique. Moscheles can write as many times as he wishes that these fast tempi did not reflect the tempi of his younger years. Still he is wrong. He's the one that makes the mistake, not we. Now, if you think about it on a more serious level, how would we possibly know how fast these musicians played? Well, for our musicologists, that's a simple question to answer. You just refer to the metronome numbers. Don't they show an incredibly high tempo already? And so, since those MMs by default must be read in half or single beat, so as we still do today, and moreover since those tempi oftentimes lay beyond what we today technically can do, although you'll never hear us say that, it cannot be the case that Moscheles heard faster tempi than the ones he himself gave for many of those works. And now a moment of silence, since I guess that last sentence needs to be repeated. Our musicologists know today that the concerts Moscheles criticized to be too fast were played according to the early 19th century standards as we've set up today, based on metronome numbers given by musicians like Moscheles. So, Moscheles criticized Moscheles. Well, that makes sense. Since yes, Moscheles is one of the editors in his days for classical repertoire. He is one of the sources for metronome marks in the works of Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, even Clementi. And all of those metronome marks are fast, on the edge of being ridiculously fast. And so, how on earth can it be that Moscheles in 1858 wrote Mozart's fast movements were carried to the extremes when those tempi, and that we all agree on today, can never have been faster than his own metronome numbers? So again, Moscheles criticizes Moscheles. How much sense does that make? Moscheles' Beethoven metronome marks, by the way, are, in the words of Sion Liu Li in her 2003 scription on Czerny's interpretation of Beethoven's sonatas, internally consistent. So those are her words, not mine. So Moscheles completely agreed to Czerny's, what we say today, ridiculous metronome numbers given by his hopelessly broken metronome. So in other words, he was completely fine with the 50 notes a second required from a student with a few years of piano lessons. Or might it have been 7.5 notes a second? Because you see, then the whole conversation changes. Speeding a Mozart symphony up from the Hummel, Czerny or Moscheles metronome numbers read according to the WBMP, the whole beat metronome practice, is not too difficult. And so, what solution would seem to be the most logical to you, even without any knowledge on the time and context? Or Moscheles criticized his own tempo indications severely as being too fast, mysteriously forgetting every time he gave similar tempi as the one he was criticizing. Or Moscheles criticized tempi that were considerably faster than the ones he gave, but in WBMP. And suddenly, we are very close to that other story we brought on the Mozart Don Giovanni Tomacek question. Link here in the info card. And from that perspective, we can connect the evolution of musical performance to all the other aspects of 19th century life. And suddenly, we can acknowledge that Erard developed a double action not for the reason to slow down tempi. That the transcendental etudes by Liszt are in fact a huge jump forward in the evolution of piano technique instead of a result of a general decline in piano playing. And as much as our top athletes today are not competing against an 1830 set world record for the 100-meter sprint, we safely can assume that the tempi we take from music of that time is far beyond what composers had in mind 200 years ago. This segment became much longer than I anticipated, and the last word has not been said about it. So yes, it's an important piece of the historical tempo puzzle we want to reconstruct. Tempi went up in the 19th century, and not by a little, by much. As we've seen in last week's episode in that case study on Czerny Opus 299, Kunkel was 43% faster in 1875, Vivian Harvey Slater on average 54% faster in 1969. That does not only make sense, it's logic in itself. So that was it for today. If all of this information makes you a bit dizzy, best thing for you to do is to subscribe to this channel and hit the bell, since our next uploads will be the best cure against that dizziness. And if you care about spreading this message of musical reconstruction, consider becoming an authentic sound insider at patreon.com. You'll find a strong community there, updates on what's going on behind the scenes, and that's a lot, my personal practicing sessions, and previews of the YouTube videos we make. Your input there does make a difference. Link below and in the description box. Thanks for watching, and see you soon again.